Hi there. Hey, Sierra, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great, thank you. I just like to check the mic, before we get started.
Yeah, no problem.
Hi, everybody. We'll get started in about 4 minutes. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Statistics Solutions Chapter 2 webinar on the literature review. A couple things before we get started. We have Sierra on with us as a co-host, and she will be providing you with links that you can access this webinar as well as other of our webinars on our website. I think you also get a copy of this sent to you in the email. If you have any kind of technical issues or questions that don't relate to the content, you can direct them toward our co-host. So yes, chapter 2, this is our structure of the dissertation is based on the 5-chapter model, which is pretty typical. There are different models with more chapters, and usually they're very similar, but sometimes the chapters are split differently. But the five chapter model is pretty standard, where chapter 1 is your introduction, chapter 2 is the literature review, chapter 3 involves the methodology, chapter 4 is your results, and chapter 5 is the discussion. So just a little bit about sorry, let me rewind just one more thing. If you have questions, we will have a question and answer session at the end. But if you have questions as we go along, you can type them in the question and answer box or the chat box, just so you don't forget them. And but if you do that, I won't, they can stay there. I'll just get to them at the end. Okay. All right. So chapter 2, the literature review. This is what we're going to be covering today. This is generally the major sections of the lit review. And the big one is the actual review of the literature that you see there, the 4th item. And that's probably 80% of the lit review. That's the bulk of it. And they're all going to be different because everybody's study is different. So before we get to the specifics of what's in the chapter, let's just kind of pull back a minute and look at the overall purpose of the lit review, because sometimes folks are kind of a little hazy about how the pieces of the dissertation fit together and what the actual purpose of the chapters are. You just kind of review the literature on your topic. Well, yeah, there's a little more to it. The lit review, it does review research on your topic and gives kind of a snapshot of the state of the research on your topic, right? Specifically focused on what you're doing. Usually recent research, some schools have different requirements that we'll get to. But it's always a good idea to stick to recent research as you can, unless something is foundational. Also, theories sometimes you can use older theories. It takes a long time for theories to be developed. But the purpose of the lit review is not only just to kind of provide context for your study, it's also it culminates into an argument for your research problem, right? So all through the literature review, what you're doing is you're noting trends, you're noting weaknesses, you're noting gaps, you're noting strengths and weaknesses of the studies, all the while kind of driving toward what hasn't been done in the literature review, in the previous literature that pushes towards your an argument for conducting your study, for it's highlighting and it's kind of advancing your research problem. So overall, you need to keep that in mind as you go through it. That yes, you are reviewing the literature, you're synthesizing the literature, evaluating it to some extent, but also, kind of making that argument for why your study is necessary based on what's in the literature and what's not in the literature. Okay. So the introduction for the lit review is pretty straightforward. Restate the purpose of your study, remind the reader of the importance and the need for your study. This will probably sound very much like material from chapter 1. Maybe the introduction or early parts of chapter 1. And if you want, you can preview contents of the chapter. To go back real quick to restate the purpose of your study. Typically, professors do not want you to copy and paste material from one part or one section of your study to another. And I agree. They professors frown on that. There's 2 cases where you could do that and you should do that. That is your purpose statement and your research questions. So every time you need to restate your purpose statement always use it verbatim, right? Because it's an encapsulation of what you're doing in your study that doesn't change. Same thing with the research questions. If there's some reason you need to restate the research questions, do it verbatim, right? But those are the only times you can get away with that. So when you restate the purpose of your study, you can restate that verbatim. And then the other stuff that reminding the reader of the importance and the need for your study, that can be paraphrased. You don't want to just kind of, again, pull the material from chapter 1 and quote or use that material verbatim, just the purpose statement itself. Okay, preview contents of the chapter, the sections, the topical sections. Once you have those down, and we'll get to the organization of the chapter in a few minutes. Okay, usually what comes next, and again, I'm going to say this several times throughout the presentation, always obtain a copy of your school's template or guidelines to see exactly what they want. Now, our template is kind of a general template that works, and it aligns pretty well with most schools' requirements. But schools sometimes have, the headings may have different titles, or they may be in slightly different order. So always get your school's template, right? But having said that, this will work as a sound general template. Usually a section called it's where you describe. Can people still hear me? Okay. It describes the process that you used and the strategies that you use to search for material for your literature review. Right. This is important because what you're trying to convey to your professors and to your readers is that you've conducted a comprehensive search, right? So you cast, a pretty tight net, a pretty wide net, a tight net to locate the relevant material for your lit review, that you didn't miss anything, right? So part of describing your strategies of how you did that is to kind of help ensure your professors and your reader that look, here's all the steps I took, here's what I did, here's what I searched, here's the databases that I used, so they can look and go, oh yeah, okay, I see that was a pretty comprehensive search. And it's always helpful, well, all parts of the dissertation to use your template, use your resources, attend webinars, talk to your professor, but sometimes just getting samples, like approved dissertations from your school in your area close to what you're doing. Sometimes there's no substitute for that, because you think you have everything down, you've heard the lectures or the webinars and the advice, and then when you sit down to write, it's harder than you think. So that's one, like having this an example at hand, it really helps you. Same for this section, same for the lit review, same for all parts of the dissertation. So really just start this section out by saying a comprehensive search for relevant material was conducted using your school's library online portal. All schools have, libraries, online libraries, and that you can access, right, and get to their databases that they subscribe to, and all the search materials. So you just want to talk about what you used, where you went, and it should be usually your school's library, the online portal. List any databases and search tools that you use. The databases are specialized, for, like, say, education. There's something called ERIC. It's an acronym: Educational Resource something, I don't remember. But there's databases that are specific to disciplines, right? There's search tools like these mega search tools, like Google Scholar is a search tool, and it searches lots of databases. Those are really helpful because they cast, they really, there's a lot of coverage. There's Academic Search Complete, Academic Search Premier. Those are similar to Google Scholar, where they search, multiple databases. And so those kinds of search tools are really good for coverage. And specific databases too. If you know there's a real important database in your area that you need to search, by all means search that, but you need to list these things, right? So your reader knows that you did look at the important databases and some of these other bigger search tools that cover, a wide range. Any specialized journals that you searched, you would want to include. Sometimes your chair will say, hey, check this journal out because it's especially germane to what you're doing. Also include any key terms. Well, the key terms that you use to search material, right? That you use to locate the relevant material, and the combinations of the terms. And these aren't any secret, right? These are what are going to be, if you're doing a quant study, they're going to be your variables. They're going to be your major ideas, the major constructs, the things that you're studying. Those will be your search terms. And this last one is important. Include any way that you qualified your search or that you filtered your search. So sometimes, you only want things that are back in English, or you only want things that are full text. But the other two are real important: date of publication and indicating that things are peer reviewed. Right. So date of publication is some schools only want you to review recent material in your lit review, like recent, published within 5 years. If that's the case, it's important then for you to say, I limited my search to material that was published within 5 years of my anticipated date of graduation. So if it would be 2017 now if you anticipate to graduate this year. So that's important. Some schools it's 5 to 7 years, some schools it's 10 years, some schools don't care. But if they do, you want to include that, the date of publication. And for all lit reviews, you want to say that the material included is primarily peer reviewed. That's really, peer reviewed empirical research is the gold standard of the lit review. You shouldn't be, reviewing websites, books sparingly. If you need to use information from a website for like statistics or something, that's fine, but that's different than kind of reviewing it, right? So the things that you actually dig into are the scholarly articles, right? Peer-reviewed scholarly articles. Again, you can use books, but I would use books sparingly. How do you know if something's peer-reviewed? Well, the easiest way is just when you're searching, right? There's options. Just return articles to me that are in English. Just return articles to me that are full text. You can even put a cap on the date of publication. Just return articles no earlier than 2017 and to the present. Return articles to me that are only peer reviewed. That's the easiest way to help ensure that your material is peer reviewed. So whatever you get back is peer reviewed. And usually right on the article or the introductory material where it gives you the abstract, it often says that the article is peer reviewed. So that's how you can confirm. Okay, that's the lit search strategy. Not too long, not even a page, probably, maybe a solid paragraph, maybe two. Okay. The theoretical framework usually comes next, but again, check your school's template. Some schools want the theoretical framework mentioned in chapter 1, and then they want it elaborated upon in chapter 2. That's pretty typical. Some schools only have it in chapter 1, some schools only have it in chapter 2. So just double check what your school is looking for. And this is where we'll talk a little bit what a theoretical foundation framework is, because there's usually question marks around that. The difference between a conceptual framework and a theoretical framework, and then a little bit about what should be in the section. The theoretical framework it's basically the theory or theories that kind of undergird your study. They're going to help guide the study. They're going to help you in chapter 5, where you have to interpret your findings in relation to previous literature. And also your theories, right? If from your theoretical framework, you can also interpret your findings in relation to your theories. So theoretical framework, conceptual framework, what's the difference? Which one should you use? I just take a real practical approach. Theoretical frameworks are typically associated with quantitative studies. Conceptual frameworks are typically associated with qualitative studies. Is there a time you ever need to use both? I suppose. I've never seen it. I've heard that, you can use both. If there's no reason for you to, if you don't know whether you should or not, I mean, I wouldn't really press it. I mean, if sometimes mixed methods, maybe like if you're doing a mixed method study, and the qual and the quant portions kind of have equal weight, you may need to use both a conceptual and a theoretical, but most of the times I've never seen two, just one. So theoretical framework primarily associated with quantitative studies. What does that mean? Let's just take, it seems like I'm always using the same example, emotional intelligence, transformational leadership. You're studying these two constructs. You're going to see if they're related. So your theoretical framework would basically consist of a theory of transformational leadership and a theory of emotional intelligence, okay? Where you would just state, simple declarative statement that these theories will serve as your framework, your theoretical foundation or your theoretical framework. Talk a little bit about who developed the theory, with the appropriate sources, the year. Theories are designed and developed to explain things. So what did this theorist develop the theory to explain? Define the theory. Sometimes people start talking about what the theory has been used for and they never stop to kind of define it. You want to define the theory along with any associated components that are relevant to your study. So for example, transformational leadership has 4 components. If those components, you're studying those as part of transformational leadership, you would want to define those components as well. Discuss a little bit about what other researchers have used the theory for. And this is important, how it connects to your study, right? So, and how it connects to your study is, what are you measuring? How does the theory help, explain what you're measuring? How does it connect to, the variables that you're looking at? So for example, you want it's helpful to go to your instrument, right? If you're doing a quant study, we'll go to qual study in a minute, but if you're doing a quant study and you have your instrument, like say your instrument to measure emotional intelligence, you want your survey or your instrument to match your theory in the sense that, let's say you're using Goldman's instrument. He's one of the the key players in the development of emotional intelligence. You're using Goldman's instrument to measure emotional intelligence. Well, then you want to use Goldman's theory of emotional intelligence for your theoretical framework, because somebody else has an instrument, you know, Baron has an instrument, and that person has a theory. Now they may align to some degree, but there may be differences. So the point is, whoever instrument you're using, you want to use that person's theory for your theoretical framework. Those two things need to align, right? You don't want to use Goldman's instrument and use Smith's theory, right? Because the component, you know, these things may not align. So make sure that, you know, that aligns. Same thing for transformational leadership. For a conceptual framework, it's very similar, but sometimes you're not using kind of full-blown theories. You're using concepts that are, you know, the concepts that you're studying that are important to your study. And you're going to define them based on what's in the literature, and you're going to use the version of that concept or the definition of that concept that's most closely aligned to what you're doing. And again, it's going to come from the literature, right? It's not going to be kind of a general definition of the concept. So it's real similar, except you're using concepts instead of theories for the conceptual framework. And also for the qualitative study, another difference is that the conceptual framework helps to guide your interview questions, right? So when you sit down to draft your interview questions, they're not just coming from nowhere, right? They're coming from those relevant concepts that you put into your conceptual framework. And again, the framework is another area, like so many other sections, that it's really good to see something on paper, what somebody's done. Because again, it's one of these things you can hear people talk about it, and you think you got it, and you sit down to write it, and then you're kind of scratching your head. Okay. And before, while I'm thinking about it, let me just pause here real quick. Another function of or purpose of the lit review, I told you, is to kind of, it's kind of a big argument for your research problem. The other part of it is how it functions then in the study too is, you know, if we're looking at the big picture, when you get to chapter 5, and you have to interpret your results, right? You have your findings, you have your results, and you're like, and you know, the template says, okay, interpret them. You're like, okay, what does that mean? Do I just say what you know, I think? What it really means is that you're going to set up a discussion of your findings as they relate to the major findings of previous literature, right? Or of previous studies. And where do you get that? Well, that's in your chapter 2, right? So that's that's another purpose of the chapter 2 and the link to chapter 5 is that when you get to chapter 5 in that discussion section where you need to discuss what your findings mean, you do that in relation to what has been found in the previous literature, which again, that you already have that in chapter 2. Okay. All right, so the next section, review of the literature, review of the relevant literature, you know, whatever it's called on your template. This is really the meat of the chapter, you know, like I'd say 80% of the chapter. This is where you're actually reviewing the studies on your topic. And not just reviewing them, kind of summarizing. So it involves several tasks. You know, there's some summary, there's some review, but there's also some analysis, right? There's also some critique. We'll get into that a little later. So it's kind of looking at the literature with an eye toward, you know, how does all this relate to my study, right? These researchers conducted a study on A and B, but they didn't include C, which is what I'm going to do. So you always want to keep that in mind, that there's this kind of evaluative aspect to the lit review, where it's not just summary, although there's a good deal of summary in it. So how do you structure this? You're going to have to, because one of the challenges is organization for this chapter, especially for this section, because you're going to have a lot of material, right? And you're going to be just kind of feel like you're drowning in material. What do I do with it all? How do I put it together? And, the most important thing to remember is, follow your study, look at your RQs, look at your purpose, look at your concepts, look at your variables, right? Because this is not a general discussion of the topic, right? It's specifically focused on what you're doing. It's specifically focused on your variables and your constructs. So use, chunk it out into headers, right? And even subheaders if you need to, but these headers should correspond pretty closely to your variables, or if it's qualitative, to your major concepts, right? What have people done? What's the research that's been done in these areas, specifically on these variables, these factors, these ideas that you're looking at in your study? Okay, yeah, use headers, right? Organize the material in sections. Typically, you start a section off. Don't just start talking about the material. I mean, have a little section introduction, why this variable has been important to the research, why it's important to look at, and then you can get into the research, the actual research that's been conducted on it. And reviewing research consists of synthesis and analysis. This goes back to what I was talking about a few minutes before. So what is synthesis? I mean, synthesis basically is just combining things to form a whole, right? So what you're doing is you're combining information from studies to help make your points, right? And this information, usually from the studies, what do you pick out? I mean, these studies are, some of them are long, they get a lot of information. I wouldn't rely solely on the abstracts, but the abstracts do help you in kind of taming the study, in the sense of what was its purpose? Who are the participants? What was the setting? What was the mode of analysis? How did they analyze data? Right? What did they find? That's real important. So use the abstracts to guide you, and you may have to dig into the studies to get some particulars. But yeah, these things like that I just mentioned, the what kind of study it was, what was the purpose of the study, maybe a little bit about the setting and the participants, how data was analyzed, and or how data were analyzed, and the findings are real important. These are the kinds of details that to kind of pull out of the studies to help make your points. And another part of not getting lost in the material is, like I said, organization at the level of sections, and with headers based on your variables and your factors, but also at the paragraph level, right? Because it's challenging when you have a lot of material, and then I know people know how to write paragraphs. I know it, but when they get into the lit review, something happens and they have too much material, and suddenly the paragraphs are all over the place, and I think that's because you have an information overload. But just fall back on your what you learned in middle school or before about what constitutes an effective paragraph, right? Which is a topic sentence, evidence or discussion of the topic, sentence, several sentences, and this would be material from the articles, and a summary, right? A summary sentence. You're also synthesizing findings from studies too, right? So you're noting where findings agree with one another or they disagree. Here's what Smith found, but that's different than what Jones found, right? Or it corroborates what Jones found, right? So you want to do a little bit of that too as part of synthesis, comparing the findings of the studies. Okay, the analysis later. Okay. So here's an example of, a pretty well-structured paragraph that includes synthesis, and it includes a little bit of analysis, which I get to on the slide after this one, but I'm not going to read the whole paragraph to you, but I'll pick out points. So the yellow is the topic sentence, as you can see. The green material is the evidence that supports or illustrates the topic sentence, and the teal is the summary sentence. Okay, so if you read, I'll leave it up here for a few minutes. If you read it, look at it, you can see how it makes a point. It brings research in from studies to discuss the point. You know, the synthesis brings them together. But there's also a little analysis in here, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. You know, so it's not just a summary, it's not just a synthesis, there's some critique in here, and I'll bring that to your attention. So if you notice in the first sentence, it says research has mostly shown, there's that qualifying word mostly, not all of it, mostly shown that health literacy is an important factor in diabetic self-control and positive outcomes. So then we have Anders, what Anders study did, what Anders found. We have Gregory et al., what their study did, what it found. Talbot, and then a little farther down, we have the study that revealed different findings. So unlike Anders et al. And Gregory, Phillips, this is about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sentences from the bottom. Unlike Anders et al. And Gregory et al., Phillips et al. Found no statistically significant relationship between diabetes knowledge and glycemic control, which they attributed to a small sample size and possibly errors associated with self-reported instruments. So there's a little bit of analysis there, right? It's pointing out that that someone did have findings that differ from most of the other ones. And there's a little bit of critique here or analysis where it explains a little bit why those findings may be different, which they attributed to a small sample size and possibly errors associated with self-reported instruments. So a possible explanation for why these findings are different. And then in the summary sentence, you can see that, again, we have the qualifying word largely. Empirical evidence from recent research largely supports that diabetic health literacy is a vital component in patients' self-efficacy, et cetera. So again, that word largely kind of qualifies it, like the word mostly up at the top. It's like most of it agrees except this one. So that's an example at the paragraph level. You know, a well-organized paragraph, synthesis, a little bit of analysis. And we'll get to analysis here. Okay. Right. So we all know what analysis is, right? It's kind of pulling things apart, looking at how things work together, but also has a little bit of evaluation to it in the sense that, you know, you're bringing up weaknesses, maybe critiques. So analysis of the research involves noting shortcomings or gaps of the studies, like I just did previously. You also want to note trends in the research, and wherever you can, if there's an opportunity to kind of reiterate your research problem, or, you know, what the research is not covering, or, you know, somehow that the research highlights what you're doing, it's also it's good to throw that in when you have the opportunity. And again, the whole lit review kind of culminates in, you know, making an argument for your research problem, for the need to conduct your study, right? Here's what, you know, the research shows, here's what's been done, yet we still don't have knowledge on, you know, whatever it is you're doing, or we don't have this kind of approach on whatever it is you're doing. So that's kind of, you know, broad strokes, general idea of the lit review. The summary, you know, recap major points from the chapter. It's a good place to remind, because you've just summarized the, you know, you've just did a review of the literature. It's a good place to remind the reader of your research problem, based on what's in the literature and what's not. And just reiterate the need for your study. Okay. That's who we are. Some of the services we provide, our contact information. If you think what we, you want to find out more about what we do, see if it's right for you. Okay, let's see. Do we have questions about the content? Anybody? I'll give you a few minutes to type something in the question and answer box. Anybody questions? Everybody's good with the lit review? Just a couple of things I'll talk about real quick. If anybody wants to type anything in. Okay, can you elaborate on your point about theory should match the instrument? Yes, I'll get there in a minute. Just let me say this real quick. The length, people have concerns about the length of chapter 2. Again, your template may specify a length. It may not. Your chair can sometimes guide you on that. I've seen 10-page lit reviews. I've seen 80-page lit reviews. But the sweet spot seems to be 20 to 30 pages. And more like 20 to 25. That seems to be what most of them fall into. So if that helps. I mean, it's a long chapter. It's a tough chapter. It just just be prepared. Use your resources, follow the template. Get assistance if you need it. It's just one of those. It's a big hill to climb, but it's doable. Okay, let me answer these questions. Let's see. Can you elaborate on your point about theory should match the instrument? Yeah. I'm not sure what kind of elaboration, how much more elaboration I can put on that. It's, yeah, the idea is if you're using, the idea is that these instruments have theoretical foundations. They don't just come, the questions just don't come from nowhere. So, you want to use a theoretical foundation that matches the instrument. And again, it's usually tied to the researchers. So again, if you're using one person's instrument, usually that person will have a theory of that, whatever it is you're measuring. Right. So the idea is don't use somebody's instrument, but then use a completely different theory. I mean, it could be a theory of the same thing, but it could be somebody else's version of the theory. So make sure the whoever you're using for the instrument, who developed the instrument, see if they have a theory of what you're measuring and use that theory. So like I said, my example was, Goldman for emotional intelligence. He has an instrument, right, to measure emotional intelligence. If you're using his instrument, use his theory, not somebody else's theory. I hope that's clear. If you need if you have a more specific question, let me know. Okay, are there many types of lit reviews? I don't know. I mean, not that I know of. I mean, sometimes there's a type of study, like advanced researchers usually, you can conduct a study that is a lit review, but it's a very specific kind of study that looks at a lot of study. It basically turns a lit review into a study itself, but that's a very specific kind of thing. And that's not what professors are looking for when they're asking you to do these lit reviews. So I suppose there are different kinds, but the one that we went over should be appropriate for what your purposes for writing a dissertation. Okay. Okay, any other questions? All right, if there's no other questions, okay, you're welcome. All right, thank you for attending. If there's no other questions, I'm going to let you go. Wish you a great rest of your day. And we do run these webinars often on different chapters, chapters 1, 3, 4, 5, and also on different topics within the chapters. So, go to our website and look at our webinar schedule to see if, there's other ones you want to pop in on. Okay, great. You're welcome. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for attending. All right. Have a great day.